Church attendance among young men aged between 18 and 24 has risen by 500%. How on earth did we get here? We were told this would make us more moral, but the average man at the minute grows up not knowing who he is, let alone what he ought to do. Here we have it, the defender of the scientific method who's going to propagate science for this generation is uninterested in whether his worldview could give rise to science. Picture me, an ex-Muslim, an ex-drug addict, and an MMA fighter all walking into a Christian gathering at the same time. No, this is not the start of a slightly edgy joke, but it's a very real cultural movement I've found myself part of. I became a Christian about 5 years ago, and at the time, it was relatively strange for someone to just start going to church as an 18-year-old. And people were always asking, Tom, what on earth has happened? How on earth did you just start picking up the Bible and going to church? People were saying, we haven't heard a story like this in years. So all of a sudden I'm getting asked all of these questions. They're like, let's get Tom to the front. Let's get him to say his story. Let's interview him. This is interesting. We're not seeing much like this at all. But over time, I sort of realised that the interest was fading away. People stopped looking so surprised when I said I'd only been a Christian for a short amount of time. And I really didn't get asked to tell the story so often. In fact, the story really sounded quite modest and tame after a while. And this dawned on me most when I was walking to a Christian gathering with a peculiar group of people that had all become a Christian in the last 18 months. And I thought, hang on a second, I'm actually the least interesting guy here, right? Now it's no longer the case where someone grows up in the middle class background and becomes a Christian and that's a novelty or it's rare. I'm no longer the minority, I'm actually part of quite a big cultural movement at the minute. It's not a rarity anymore. In fact, something that I've seen anecdotally has recently been confirmed statistically. So some of these studies, and we'll put them on screen, have shown in some cases, church attendance among young men aged between 18 and 24 has risen by 500% between 2018 and 2024. Pretty dramatic if you ask me. That's a 5 times increase in young men church attendance in just a few years. How on earth has that happened? And as someone who's been part of that movement myself, i.e. I've fit the age bracket and I fit the time period for becoming a Christian in that time period and starting going to church, but at the same time, I've been involved in discussions about faith in multiple different university campuses in different cities. I think I've, through that time, made some observations that might help us answer the question of how on earth did we get here? I'm not really trying to answer that exhaustively. Rather, I think my situation might be able to share some light on this broader cultural movement that's happening right now to help give clarity and help maybe spark discussion about what's going on in young men. So, why on earth are young men going to church again? I'm going to attempt to answer this question partly in this video with a follow-up video coming, and my main argument in this video is that the movement towards church can be linked with the previous rise and decline of the new atheists, where you have the printing revolution of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, where they're producing very strong atheistic content that's by and large sold very, very well, especially among young men. Well, the reason why I think that's related is that the new atheists made promises in those writings about what a religionless future would look like. And I believe young men are sort of looking back on promises that were made to them and feeling like they haven't been delivered. And I want to argue that this is because the new atheists could not provide a worldview that would substantiate their vision for society. And actually, it seems as though young men are finding the Christian alternative a better means of delivering similar promises, right? So this video is going to be part 1 of the argument where we think about the rise and decline of atheism and how that's linked to this movement towards church. And part 2 will be thinking about purely the Christian distinctives that young men find particularly compelling at the moment. So, to understand the demise of new atheism, we must first consider the full force of the attractiveness of the movement. The first thing they promised was rationality. And I think the new atheists were particularly compelling on this point, right? Who doesn't want this? Who doesn't want to be intelligent? Who doesn't want to be free-thinking, ruled by reason rather than superstition? You can see how compelling it would be, the allure of being told, in this group, we're almost smarter, more rational than our indoctrinated religious counterparts. But it seemed as though there was more than going on than just the promise the removal of religion will make you free-thinking and rational. Dare I say you felt part of the in crowd? Richard Dawkins literally called people to join as defenders of reason. What a title that is. Imagine being a defender of reason. That's a pretty attractive title, I'd say. As though this group were these soldiers fighting to defend the mind from blind superstition that's threatening to attack it. And ironically, that wasn't always through rational argumentation. This was a group that was so guided by reason, in the contrary to how religious people think, that religious people were probably not capable of understanding rational dialogue itself. So instead, the cause is fought through mockery.
Mock them, ridicule them. Religion makes specific claims about the universe which need to be substantiated and need to be challenged and, if necessary, need to be ridiculed with contempt.
Now, as much as this will probably jar with the sensibilities of people 20 years later, you can imagine the sense of purpose, identity that this gave to young men. Imagine being surrounded by all of these high-flying intellectuals. You've got successful biologists that have made very meaningful contributions in their field. You've got journalists who were very successful in their political theories, and you have computer programmers, engineers. You have the accolades among this group were very prominent. And the call was, well, come and join us, come and be rational. And these rational men, what were they called to do? Well, they were called to save society. How? By liberating the bonds of religion that threaten reason, and by being leaders of a new free-thinking world where we're no longer held back. Look at the way Sam Harris puts it. He says, "We are by no means hopeless. Although the world is simply ablaze with bad ideas, i.e. religion, it is obvious that an utter revolution in our thinking could be accomplished in a single generation." And how so? How will this utter revolution take place where these bad ideas that are spreading are put to death? Well, it's as simple as parents and teachers merely giving honest answers to the question of every child. Just be honest. Just answer honest questions honestly. Just be rational, and we can see those young people grow up to be rational, free-thinking people, liberated from the bonds of religion. And if you can't see the implicit duty, or dare I say oughtness, that runs through the core of this promise for rationality, then I hope my next point will draw that out specifically. The new atheists not only promised reason, but they promised the removal of religion will make a more moral society. It's interesting, when I was reading God Delusion, I was struck by how moral in nature the arguments actually were, which I wasn't quite expecting. I was expecting a scientist to be giving scientific explanations for most things. But what you see is actually a deeply moral outlook, a deeply moral charge for how the world should look, and pointing out the harm, the danger of religion. And you can understand why young men would see this as compelling. Look at the way Richard Dawkins puts it. It is not just truly tragic to die having missed out on the truths of the universe that are so engrossingly fascinating and beautiful. Oh, he is an incredible writer, isn't he? It was also a fundamental evil to be purged from society. So you can imagine what he's saying here. He's saying that it's tragic. It's absolutely tragic to die having missed out on the wealth of information in the universe. And we can get a telescope and look up to space, and we can see all of this. And you're choosing to die having not been engrossed by the fascinating and beautiful. There's something wrong with that. There's this deep duty to save others from doing so. It's not just that religion is superstitious, it's actually evil. And if you refuse to get on board, you're leading people astray, causing them to die not knowing the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's a moral argument if I've ever heard one. I was particularly struck when he said, "If you dare tempt children down this barren path, it is a sin so grievous that it brings millstones fleetingly to mind." Here he's referring to the story where Jesus speaks to some religious leaders, and he says, if you cause these children to stumble, it would be better for you for a mill rock to be turned around your neck and to be dropped into an ocean, right? Because of the judgment that would come for that particular kind of heinous sin. Well, Richard Dawkins is comparing that to tempting a child down the barren path of religion. Look at how Christianity is presented here.
People got along just fine for thousands of years without AA, just like they got along for thousands of years without religion.
I like you and have no reason not to.
I like you and have no reason not to.
Hey, did you hear about that magic baby that was born in Bethlehem?
Oh, I actually love Family Guy. It's clear to see that if religion has caused all of the world's evils, or some of them, or a lot of them, there is a very easy solution to removing the world's evils, right? The atheistic enterprise was not just to make us more rational, it was to protect our children from abuse, to protect our constitution from corruption, and to rescue those who are brainwashed. It almost latched onto this male instinct to protect and to provide, and drew people to stand up for the sake of a promise of a more moral society, and to actually go out and fight. That's why they became defenders of reason. Well, because they had a moral obligation to do so. The foundation of society that they wanted to build was one where we teach our children to think scientifically rather than religiously, and we ought to do so. And this leads me on to the third and final premise of New Atheism, well, the scientific method. Perhaps the New Atheists were most well known for being advocates of science. To them, science is factual, evidence-based, and divorced from emotional bias. And it's as simple as Richard Dawkins said, what I believe as a scientist, I believe not because of reading a holy book, but because I have studied the evidence. If something's true for him, it's not because some ancient prehistoric text tells him so, it's because he's seen it in a test tube, right? He's studied the evidence, and that's how he knows that something is true, not just because a fairy tale from a long time ago tells him so. And their vision for humanity was one where truth came from investigation, from being scrutinized via the scientific method. If it can't be, well, it's not a justified belief and it should be eradicated from society at large. Truth comes from data, not dogma. And if we want to be people of the truth, we must be free from indoctrination. And if we succeed in this, if we succeed of removing indoctrination and having an evidence-based outlook, a scientific outlook, then think about the technological progress and advancements and developments that could be made. Again, look at the way Family Guy put it.
Where are we? This is Cohort, Brian. Same year, same time. But in this universe, Christianity never existed, which means the dark ages of scientific repression never occurred, and thus humanity is 1,000 years more advanced. And
this promise, I don't think is described any more compellingly than in Richard Dawkins' God Delusion. He describes a guy called Kurt Wise, who is a PhD geologist who graduated from Harvard, as an expert in his field. That's a very significant title to have. But before finishing his PhD in geology, he came to the conclusion that he could not square the opening chapters of Genesis with his scholarship as a geologist. For those who live under a rock, working in this kind of institution studying geology would be nearly impossible as someone who believes in a 6,000-year-old Earth. So Kurt Wise had this life and career-shaping decision to make. In his view, something that was eternity-shaping. Does he continue with what he's found with his studies in regards to the age of the Earth? Or does he draw his conclusion from his reading of the early chapters of Genesis? Well, he decides he's going to be like Martin Luther and say, here I stand, on what he considers to be the true interpretation of the passage. But Richard Dawkins does not see this as an act of bravery or courage in any way, shape or form. He actually says it's not anything like Martin Luther. It's something as pathetic as Winston Smith in 1984, who's struggling desperately to believe that 2 + 2 = 5 if Big Brother tells him so. He argues here, fundamentalist religion is hell-bent on ruining scientific education of countless thousands of well-meaning, innocent and eager minds. Do you see he's using that Kurt Wise story to show how a fundamentalist religion has purged a rigorous and a great scientific education that someone's built up. So we must, like Winston Smith decides at a point, fight the regime of Big Brother by not succumbing to their lies and their doublespeak. And how do we do so? Well, we follow the scientific method rather than religious superstition. I do find it particularly interesting that Richard Dawkins compares fundamentalist Christianity to Big Brother in 1984, because 20, 30 years on, there's this new literature analogy that captivated the minds of young men. While Dawkins would describe the throwing off of the shackles of religion as something to liberate us from Big Brother, young men today are looking at a progressive, liberal, secularist world, and they're saying, I want to also throw off these shackles. But they've called this a red pill in some cases.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
In the same way that someone like Winston Smith might try to subdue his mind or have his mind subdued by Big Brother to believe the doublespeak that it propagates, well, young men see themselves in a similar way seduced by a blue pill that masks reality. And although I'm very aware that this movement has a tendency to veer in directions that don't correlate with Orthodox Christianity or Christian values to some extent, I think there's a very core contingent of people who've interpreted this red pill awakening as waking up from what they would describe as the lies and the laws of secularism, and instead embracing something rich and ancient and traditional. This message that's tried and tested, it comes from the past, actually seems to constitute a better reality. It's not the quick consumption of today's generation, but actually it's a red pill, it's a waking up from this sort of world that's been created around us by secularism and consumerism. It's a waking up from that to some degree. So it poses the question again, doesn't it? How on earth has this happened? We've seen a complete 180, haven't we? From the Big Brother being fundamentalist religion to the blue pill being secularism. Why have the minds of young men sort of changed on this to such an extent in quite a short period of time? Well, with the benefit of hindsight, I think we can look at the world around us, one that in many cases, especially in the UK where this statistics came from, we have by and large ditched religion, especially from the public sphere. And we can ask the question, did the promises of atheism come to fruition? Because a lot of people have done what were promised, that they have stopped going to church, they have become less religious, they have stopped listening to religious opinions. Has it worked? So the new atheists made their promises. They promised rationality, morality, and the scientific method. But today's generation feel lost. We were told this would make us more rational, but people today feel that often truth is way more driven by emotion than reason. People feel like we're way more susceptible to a charismatic rhetorical leader who swoops in rather than a careful and reasonable argument. I really don't think that young men feel like society has become more rational. We were told this would make us more moral, but the average man at the minute grows up not knowing who he is, let alone what he ought to do. I feel as though they've been left with this massive burden to define themselves and create their own purpose for how they're to live morally. And I just don't think that young men see that as particularly compelling or useful. And it doesn't feel more moral. In fact, when they look at the world, I think a lot of people are seeing a world that they don't like morally at the minute. Ironically, it seems that the lack of dogma at the minute about what's right and wrong has actually led to more dogmatic ideas to flourish and spread. Young men, I think, in some cases feel weaponless against, you've got this polarization of radical views on every side. There's all kinds of different moral absurdities that you can find at the minute, and it's almost like we feel defenseless, we feel weaponless. It's almost as though they've accidentally disarmed themselves in an attempt to bring peace. They've left the very bastion that could protect them from extremism. I think that's probably why you see a big rise in things like nationalism. People were saying, well, we ditched that because we were told that was kind of dogmatic. But now we're seeing more dogmatic, more harmful ideas come back. Maybe those dogmas did protect us. That's one of the ways that young men are thinking. We were told that this would make us more scientific, but I don't think young men at the minute are seeing threat to the scientific method come from Christians. I think they're more worried about postmodernism and relativistic thinking and how that has implications on things like the scientific method. Many feel as though we're in this kind of post-truth age, and maybe they're going to university and hearing a lecturer say that mathematics are nothing but a colonial construct, that the laws of logic are white supremacist ideas. When you hear things like that, actually, and you see this in the new atheists themselves, we don't need to be debating Christians anymore, right? These guys aren't the threat to the scientific method. If I'm going to be a defender of reason, I've got to protect these truths because they lie at the foundation of the scientific method. People don't feel as though our society is more scientific in a lot of ways. How often do we hear the term fake news paraded around at the minute? It seems as though evidence-based information, although a wealth of information is available to us, evidence-based information just seems lacking in most cases. And people feel that. People aren't sure where to trust, what news sources they should look at, what journalism they should look at, and what's propaganda and isn't. What young men are feeling intuitively is something that's previously been described in quite lucid terms by George Orwell. He says, imagine Western society being sat on a branch on a tree and thinking, I've got to liberate myself from what came beforehand and have a new future. So they soar and soar away at the branch they're sat on. Where do they fall? Well, they don't fall into a bed of roses as they expected. They fell into barbed wire. What they had previously on the tree was there to protect them, right? And they've lost it. It reminds me of what G.K. Chesterton said is, don't remove a fence unless you know why it was first put up. Young men feel as though we're removing all of these things, but maybe there was actually a reason why they were put up in the first place. I felt like I've soared away at the tree I'm set on, and now I'm falling. And especially for young people, they feel like they've inherited this world the world that's a cesspit of barbed wire. They weren't necessarily the ones doing the cutting, but they've just inherited the cesspit of barbed wire, and they've gone, hang on a minute, this isn't what was promised. So now really it's the crux of the matter, isn't it? Why do these ideas of disenchantment with society lead people to go to church? Why is that solution? Well, and I think people have thought this quite intuitively in most cases, but they've sort of seen a relation between ancient traditions, and especially the ancient traditions that built up England and UK and British culture, and the development of the things they love about Western society. So they've seen that relation and they've gone, right, maybe something in the past is useful, maybe it is the church that could protect us here. I want to argue that rationality, morality, and the scientific method aren't just these self-evident truths that we can just inherit, but they come from a peculiar and particular foundation. It's the Christian worldview itself that provides the necessary presuppositions to give rise to rationality, morality, and the scientific method. So the Christianity is sort of the precondition for those values. In other words, I think these concepts come intelligible within a Christian framework in a way that they maybe don't in new atheist worldviews, especially the ones that were paraded by the new atheists. And when I stand upon the foundation of the Bible, rationality, morality, and the scientific method make sense in that way. I'm definitely not saying that an atheist can't think rationally, act morally, and conduct research using the scientific method. I think that would be absurd. But for the following reasons, I don't think that the atheistic worldview could give an account for those things to be an adequate philosophical foundation, be the precondition that would give rise to it. I don't think they could provide a reasoned justification for persuading someone to be moral, scientific, and rational. So firstly, the new atheist promised rationality, but the question is, can a worldview derived from naturalism provide an account for the reliability of human reason? Well, Alvin Plantinga would argue no. In fact, he says that the combination between evolution and naturalism can't account together for rationality. He calls this the evolutionary argument against naturalism. It's worth pointing out this isn't an argument against evolution. I think he might well be a theistic evolutionist himself, but he's arguing that if you hold to evolution and naturalism, then the combination of those two would render your trust in rationality incoherent. And let me explain why. So if naturalism and evolution are simultaneously true, then the origin of the human mind is dependent solely on survival of the fittest, right? That's sort of what evolution would teach, isn't it? That the human brain has come from adaptation over time through the mechanism of survival of the fittest, through natural selection. This means that our cognitive faculties have developed not for the purpose of knowing truth, but for the purpose of survival. And he would argue that if this is the case, then therefore we are not able to trust our brain's ability to know truth. Let me break it down. So imagine a prehistoric man runs away from a tiger because he believes for some reason that that would bring him good karma. He would survive, wouldn't he, on that basis? And he'd reproduce on that basis. The adaptive behavior would aid survival without having much involvement by the way of true belief, right? It doesn't matter whether that belief is true or false for it to be useful for survival and to become an adaptive behavior. So the natural selection would work on this basis, would cause this belief and adaptation to be passed on without the need to be connected to truth at all. So then the natural question that follows on from that is, how do you then know that your cognitive faculties are geared to give you truth, not just beliefs that will help you survive, right? Because that's actually counter the purpose behind evolution, to provide you with a brain to help you survive. Why do we think that our brains are there to help us know truth? The trouble with this is that we rely on our cognitive faculties to reach conclusions that we regard as true, but our confidence in this is severely hampered if what Alvin Plantinga is arguing is true. So we could come up with plenty of things that were untrue beliefs that would be useful for survival. Think religion, for instance. I'm sure you can conceive of a religious system that helps us to survive, yet it's just not true, it's false. But do your cognitive faculties allow you to make that differentiation as though your brain is geared for truth rather than survival? Because if survival is the one calling the shots, then truth doesn't. And although definitely there are times, and maybe most of the time, truth is useful for survival, correlation is not guaranteed because we can give multiple examples to the contrary. So then what he's arguing is that it would be unlikely that your cognitive faculties are reliable on evolution and naturalism. So he would go so far as to say that this would mean naturalism and evolution are self-referentially incoherent, right? Difficult to say. In that, if you hold to survival of the fittest as the only mechanism that gives rise to the human brain, then you have no reason to trust your brain in regards to your naturalism belief. Do you see what he's saying? Is your belief in naturalism purely just a mechanism that will aid your survival? Or do you believe it because there's some kind of truth mechanism at work, that your brain is there to give you true beliefs, not just beliefs that would help you survive? Well, he says that would be unlikely. So then the belief in evolution would cause a problem for you to say, I'm also a naturalist. Because if you're an evolutionist, then why would you trust your brain to know a system like naturalism and not just things that are useful for survival? And he makes this argument by drawing on something that Charles Darwin himself said. But then with me, the horrid doubt arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust the convictions of a monkey's mind? And there is a solution that would make our cognitive faculties reliable here. Alvin Plantinga would say, well, if we're made in the image of God, then we can rely on the fact that our brains aren't merely a product of survival of the fittest. They've also been designed to know true things about the universe and about God. So then we can actually make a differentiation about what's useful for survival and what's actually true. But there are other arguments that are put forward that in a naturalistic worldview, it has implications for our use of the brain for reason. J.P. Moreland and John Lennox are thinkers who have argued in this way. They would say that on naturalism, the brain is purely material, right? And our thinking is constituted entirely by physical states and events. It's purely physical. So then we don't have this immaterial mind and soul that gives rise to consciousness, meaning our thinking is nothing but the product of neurochemistry of chemical and electrical events. And on this hypothesis, and I think this is widely affirmed, that the ability to freely choose is just an illusion, right? Our will is completely controlled by the environment. Humans don't have the ability to transcend those chemical events, but then those chemical events are the ones that give rise to our process of thinking. So then we're not rational agents. We don't have rational agency. Like when people say my body, there's no my that's separate to my body, for instance. I don't know if there's a grammatical way of doing that. In that, I am my body. I am nothing but physical chemical matter. So then, I don't have this ability to transcend the environment, the way chemicals work. I'm merely a product of neurochemistry in what I'm doing and what I'm thinking and how I reason towards different things. I guess in other words, when we come to a conclusion, it isn't necessarily reasoned, but it's caused. It's like a mechanism. You wouldn't call a machine rational because there's nothing in there that's making decisions, drawing evidence together and coming to a conclusion. It's just cause and effect. Is thinking nothing but cause and effect? That's an important question. And if that's the case, and our thinking is determined by physical laws rather than rational truth-seeking, then no belief is rationally held. They are all a product of neurochemistry. I guess what the atheist has to posit, or the naturalist has to posit here, is, well, why is it that you think that someone is able to codify evidence into a theory, receive arguments, and judge their cogency? Because when we have any kind of rational discussion, like now, I'm assuming that you're able to take what I'm saying and critically analyze it. It sort of assumes that you're not just controlled by physical elements, that are the environment that's causing you to think, because thinking would just be a cause and effect mechanism. And it would also be sort of random chemical reaction, which, well, why do we think that that's geared towards truth rather than just it being random? Again, this has a solution in the Christian worldview. If it is true that we have an immaterial nature in addition to the material nature, then being made in the image of God, we can make rational decisions, we can come to rational conclusions, because there is a me who's distinct from my body. And if I do have an immaterial nature, an immaterial mind that's doing thinking and is able to weigh up hypotheses, then I'm neurochemistry plus, which is important. I find it relatively ironic that one of the prevailing arguments within the new atheist literature was their call for morality. Because one of the most pervasive arguments for theism in recent years is the moral argument. And the moral argument is something like that for us to have objective morality, we must have a universal, unchanging, and moral being for that to make any sense. So let me sort of break down why. If you have any sort of moral claim, say murder is wrong, well, we've got to question that. Why is that correct? And you might think, well, it's just intuitive, but for some people it's not. Like what if we happen to live in a society where people by and large think killing a certain kind of person is okay? Well, on what basis do you stand up for the minority and say, no, that's actually not right, you ought not do that? On what basis do you call them to charge? Because the laws might be for them, the moral system of the society might be for them. So then what do you point to? Right? You must point to something that's unchanging. It would be completely arbitrary for that to be right in one generation and wrong in the next. It must be universal, right? It can't just be that these particular kinds of people can't murder. It must be universal. And it must, I think, be immaterial as well. It can't be grounded in what you think. If you have one opinion, I have mine, well, we need to look outside of ourselves to know who's correct there. It can't just be opinion-based. And you think about, well, if it was just subjective, and how arbitrary would that make morality? Would saying that I hate genocide be the same as saying I don't like chocolate, or I hate chocolate, or I hate Brussels sprouts? That one's an opinion, one's something that you look at and you think that ought change, right? But then opinion's just, it's arbitrary. What if someone disagrees with you? Someone says, I like Brussels sprouts. I mean, on what basis do we have an argument about that? We're just going to come to conclusions. But if there's an unchanging, moral, universal law which transcends culture, transcends our opinions, then that can ground an objective morality. C.S. Lewis comes as one of the reasons why he becomes a Christian is through the moral argument. And I think it was first his conversion to theism, because he was looking at the world, and well, let me give you the quote. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. So he was looking at the world and going, there's a problem of evil here. How can God exist if we have so much evil in the world? But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some example of a straight line, some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe to when I called it unjust? So do you see what he's saying here? He's saying that the problem of evil, in some degree, is a problem for the theist, but more so it's probably a problem for the non-theist, because if they look at something that's evil and say, no, the world is like this and it ought not be the case, well, on what basis? To what standard are you comparing the world to say it ought to be better? Or you look at suffering or any kinds of evil and say that's wrong. Why? He's saying, where do I get the idea of just and unjust? Well, I must have a straight line if I know that a line's crooked. If I look at murder and I look at an atrocious moral event that's happened, and I say that is wrong, to what standard of morality am I comparing it to? Where's the straight line so that I can call the line crooked? And the new atheist would often say that our morality comes out of evolution. But I think there's two major problems with this. Well, firstly, the theory of evolution as a moral foundation, I think if that's taken to its logical conclusion, would be pretty deplorable. I think it would create a completely antithetical moral system to the one that we know and love in the West. If morality is just this social construct that we codify into society because it's useful for survival, then why protect the vulnerable? If somebody comes to you and says, look, we have an aging population, we have disabled, we have the mentally impaired, they are a burden to society, and if they are put to death, our survival will be enhanced and will flourish. Oh my days, I can imagine all of us would look at that and say that guy is an enemy. But on that hypothesis, why are they wrong? We really do spend resources protecting the vulnerable. Think about this example, like imagine a young firefighter going into a burning building to save a really old couple who are frail. Well, why? Why do such a thing? But we see that as a virtue. We see the strong protecting the weak as a virtue. That flips survival of the fittest completely on its head, doesn't it? And I think, as Glenn Scrivener's known for saying, the Christian view that we've been most profoundly shaped by is not survival of the fittest at the expense of the weakest, but actually the sacrifice of the fittest for the sake of the weakest. Right? He's drawing on this Christian idea of, say, the cross, where God himself comes to earth, almost the best, sacrifice himself for the worst. It says, while we were still sinners, while we were still weak, Christ came to die for the ungodly. You see that in Philippians 2, this great hymn in the Bible, where it says, though he was in the form of God, and by very nature God, he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He became humble by becoming a man, taking on the form of a servant and coming to die. So you have the fittest sacrificing himself for the sake of the weakest. That is actually the value that we love and cherish in the West, not the contrary. And then the second point was, I think the theory of evolution would give rise to a pretty arbitrary moral system. And don't just take my word for it. Look at how Richard Dawkins gets pushed to this conclusion himself.
What we're saying, I think we're probably agreeing, is that there are certain universal moral principles which everybody has, regardless of their religion and whether they have a religion at all. I see no problem with deriving that from our evolutionary origins. We all have noses, we all have eyes, we all have knees, and these have all evolved. We all have sexual desires because they've evolved. Why shouldn't we have this sense of what's moral? Things like the golden rule, things like do as you would be done by.
But if we had evolved into a society where rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine?
I don't want to answer that question.
Okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. I mean,
You could say that, yeah.
A scientific theory like evolution can only tell us what there is. It doesn't give us an ought. It can't tell us how things ought to be. And morals, by definition, are oughts, aren't they? We're describing not how things are. We're not looking at a test tube and saying this is what it is. We're not looking in a microscope and saying this is what's here. We're saying this is how things ought to be. And that's something that you can't get from something like evolution. Evolution can just tell us what there is. So then that takes me on to the last promise, the scientific method. I was recently reading a lecture by Oppenheimer, who they made the film about recently, entitled Reflections on Science and Culture. And as a secular Jew, he's sort of wrestling and thinking about and asking the question of where does the scientific age come from and why is it connected to some degree to Christianity? He says this: I think that one came to have a rapid, progressive, cumulative and accelerating growth of science in Western Europe with the Reformation and the rediscovery of antiquity, precisely because in this land the ancient idea of progress, which you find in the Old Testament more even than in the New, the idea of the meaningful of man's history and the idea of progressive betterment of man's condition for the first time took root, and for the first time animated and determined the mood of a civilization. I think, therefore, that what one sees in the Enlightenment, the notion of brotherhood, of equality and of progress, and the belief in the value of science and its application, and the rapid growth of science itself, are a family of related things. Do you see what he's arguing here? He's saying the ideas of progress, meaningfulness of man's history and work, alongside the moral betterment, the moral mandate to better man's condition, can all be attributed as factors that catalyse the scientific age, and all of which were rediscovered through reading the Old Testament as much as the New Testament, right? And he's not a lone voice in saying this. In fact, these arguments are taken, I think, even further by some modern historians today. As Rodney Stark, the professor of sociology at Baylor University, says, the success of the West, including the rise of science, rests entirely on religious foundation. So there's this complementary interaction between the development of the scientific method and Christianity that has been picked up by historians. And this idea, although it's contrary to what was said by the new atheists, it's not a fringe idea in the scholarship. In fact, the disparate voices pushing against the masses on this topic seem to be the new atheist ones. They found themselves standing against a scholarly consensus on the topic. And in some ways, they seem to believe in a myth. It's interesting, for people that were really skeptical, or claimed to be skeptical, seemed to be unskeptical when it came to accepting historic ideas that favoured their position. Rodney Stark also says, just as there were no dark ages, there was no scientific revolution. Rather, the notion was invented to discredit the medieval church. So this conflict view between Christianity's relation to the scientific method was an Enlightenment myth that historians have seen through, right? There's no case where we have this dark ages, this medieval time period where technological advancement and the scientific method was suppressed by the church, so we couldn't flourish. And the Greeks had it good with their education, and the Christians came and the church came and put darkness onto Europe. Well, that was just a way for the Enlightenment thinkers to say, we're the Enlightenment. We're the enlightened ones. So what came before us was dark because we're the light ones, right? You can see where that idea can come from. Rodney Stark argues that, to the contrary, the scientific method was actually absent among the great Greek and Eastern philosophers, while it slowly evolved out of medieval Christian Europe. And you think about, well, it's precisely, in many cases, the Christian worldview itself that would come to give rise to the scientific method. It's not just by chance that, well, everyone was Christian, so if the scientific method were to develop, it would come in a Christian land. Well, actually, the worldview is connected to the development. So as Johannes Kepler said, the chief end of all investigation of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony imposed on it by God. The fathers of the scientific method believed that the world was created orderly and intelligibly, hence why they would study it. And I think the sort of the Christian foundation for the scientific method can actually be illustrated by two of the greatest atheistic thinkers, Bertrand Russell and David Hume. So they both wrote about something called the problem of induction. And induction is this concept that science depends on. For example, if I have this water bottle, if I were to drop it, if I were to let go, well, I could infer validly that if I let go and it falls consistently, it will always do so. I will infer that if A has often caused B, there's a causal link between A and B. And you can see how the scientific method would depend on that. We need to use induction to go from experiment to theory about the universe and how things work together. But there's this question that needs to arise. How do we know that induction is valid? How do we know that A will always cause B, obviously if the same circumstance is there? In other words, the question is, how do we know that the future will resemble the past? Right? A has always caused B, but how do we know that it will always cause B? And you could answer and say, well, every time we've done A, B has always occurred. So surely, if I've always dropped the bottle and it's fallen, then surely every time that's always happened. Why would it not happen? But what that does is that means that we rely on the experience of past events to then make predictions about future events. So to make that argument, you'd need to use induction. And that's why they would call that circular. We would be working from past events to make predictions about future events, the very thing that we're questioning. Well, how do we know? How do we know that that's a reliable principle? I would need to know that the future will resemble the past. But how do I do so without relying on the fact that the future will resemble the past in my reasoning? So then this is a problem because we need to provide a rational justification for why we do the scientific method and why it's reliable. We can't just say, well, it's always worked that way. Well, that's the very thing we're trying to answer and work out here. Induction, therefore, doesn't come from empirical evidence. It must be something that's held a priori. It must come before the investigations for it to be relied upon. And how did we come to this a priori view, and how did this develop? Well, there's a peculiarly Christian belief that the world is created orderly and intelligibly by a rational being who is keeping the physical laws and constants the same. It's not the case that, as Richard Dawkins said, that the universe is nothing but blind, pitiless indifference or a product of random chance. I think this would pose a problem to the scientific method. Rather, the universe is uniform because it's upheld by a creator. And this a priori belief would give a rational justification for the belief in induction, which is the cornerstone of the scientific method. And we can add further to this. Think about what we've said about rational minds. If we're not able to trust our reason and our cognitive faculties, then the scientific method becomes really problematic, doesn't it? But it's not just that, because the Greeks also thought that the mind was rational, and they were able to deduce universal truths from their reason. But their problem was that it was rarely tested by observational science in the way that the scientific method would teach. It was rarely observable, measurable, repeatable. But then how did we come to that idea of the scientific method? Well, as much as Christians believe that humans are rational, made in the image of God, we also simultaneously believe that people are sinful, right? And why is that relevant? Well, sin has impacted our ability to come to true beliefs, not because our cognitive faculties aren't reliable, but because we're shaped more by emotion than reason sometimes. We suppress the truth with a lie. We deceive ourselves and we deceive others. The heart is deceptive among all things. So how did Christians get around this? Well, when they came up with a theory, they tested it. Other people tested it. It was scrutinized through observational, repeatable, and measurable studies. And that's a really core factor that gave rise to the scientific method itself. And it's fascinating, it's absolutely fascinating how Richard Dawkins deals with this argument.
You need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption of the space?
I suppose it does. I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, by the way. I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary.
Oh, is that right? Is that right, Dr. Dawkins? You're uninterested in whether your worldview gives rise to the scientific method. Here we have it. Here we have it. The defender of the scientific method who's going to propagate science for this generation is uninterested in whether his worldview could give rise to science. I find that disappointing. So by way of final thoughts, if my observations on culture are correct, you can imagine why young men feel as though they're left in despair. Imagine a world where rationality, morality, and the scientific method are nothing but constructs, mere figments of our imagination, trying to find order out of a universe of chaos. And those are the things that they were sold the dream on, and it's almost as though they're being ripped from under their feet. The wool's being pulled from under their feet. And I think a lot of people have probably reflected on what this would mean, what it would mean if Richard Dawkins' proposition is true, and the universe really were nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Christian philosopher Francis Schaeffer would want us to think about it in this way. He often translated, he tracked philosophical ideas as that through the realm of artistry, and he thinks about despair. He looks at Picasso, an atheist, and as an atheist, Francis Schaeffer would say he had no transcendent and universal reference point that would give meaning to each particular. So you think of his abstract art, his cubism, well, it was a way of representing the world where there was no overarching truth that could give each individual piece meaning. And Schaeffer would claim Picasso was committed to communicating this world without coherence, this world without intelligibility. And he's pretty consistent with that until you look very, very closely at a couple of his paintings and you see the words, "I love Eva." Although Cubism wasn't there to communicate propositional realities to the viewer, these words really do communicate something profound. It's almost as though he's painted this chaotic universe onto the canvas, and he does that because he wants his canvas to be consistent with his worldview. But then his love for Eva is so real to him that he could not help but paint it onto the canvas and communicate it intelligibly. His canvas was unintelligible until Eva stepped in. And now this could be interpreted in one or two ways. Is Eva's presence on the canvas an irrational leap that shows a moment of cowardice at the face of just facing the reality of an unintelligible universe? Surely he just ought to do that. Or was Picasso's love for Eva so real that it pointed to a universal that could make sense of his canvas? Was this one piece of reality stepping into the chaos? And you know what? I have found the Christian answer to this question just completely and perpetually enchanting. Picasso's love for Eva is real because the origin story of the universe is not blind, pitiless indifference, but love itself. The God of the Bible is described as love, not just loving, but his very nature itself is love. Well, how can this be the case? Well, God didn't begin to love when there were humans for him to love. He didn't begin to be relational when he started to relate to people. The Christian view is that he's eternally existed within a relational union of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We'd call this a Trinity, or he's in this tri-unity where these three persons have consistently and perfectly loved each other for all eternity. So this God doesn't change when there's humans. You can see how he could be charged with that if he was on his own and then creates and then loves that creation. Does he begin to love then? Well, no, because God the Father has always loved God the Son and vice versa. And then humans are created in the image of that God, of the God that is love, with the capacity to love and to relate to one another and to relate to God. As personal beings who desire to know and to be known, he creates them. And now you may have a picture of Christians where you think, well, you guys just have such a low view on what a human is. You're always going on about this sin. But think about it in this way. We talk about sin because we have a really high view on what a human is. We believe that humans are created in the image of this God of love, where he shares some of his unique attributes, some of his communicable attributes with us. And yet, when you look at the world, when you look at people, you see strife, greed, and hate. The way I like to think about it is, imagine you see a rat in a gutter eating. You don't think much of it. But if you saw a king in the gutter eating like a rat, you would go, oh my days, that is absolutely deplorable. What on earth is that king doing? Right? You don't look at a rat and say, oh, that rat ought to be doing better. But you look at the king eating like a rat and going, what are you doing? That's awful. We're people made in the image of God, yet the way we live is far short of that standard. And that's why we have this broken world pictured in the Bible. One of the things that's so fascinating about reading the Bible for the first time is that you see it really wrestle with this idea of suffering. The Bible is very honest with the fact that we live in a broken world, and we're broken people in that broken world. But what's unique about Christianity is that just like Eva stepping foot into Picasso's canvas, well, love steps into the broken world through the person of Jesus. The universe becomes intelligible because the God of love steps into it and reveals himself. And here's a really distinct claim of Christianity. If God the Son steps into human history, is seen, lives, dies, and rises from the dead, and that really happened, then would that not give meaning in a very unique way to your canvas? Would that not make sense of the particulars? It's not just that you would have this nice set of ideas that give rise to rationality, the scientific method, and morality, but you have truth, not just a set of ideas, but truth himself, or truth himself, walking the earth and being seen. It's not just a persuasive set of ideas, but he was a person, right? He says, I'm the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And in that, you have this mysterious message where everyone that comes to him, we're described as in union with God the Son in such a way that this bond of love that's always existed for all eternity between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we're brought in. Because when Jesus goes to the cross, he's punished as though he lived my life. But then he's punished as though he lied my lies, as though he sinned my sins. But we trade places. I'm then identified with Jesus, with the perfect man, so that when God the Father looks at me, he doesn't see my life, but he sees Jesus' life. So I'm brought into this relational union that's always existed, that had no beginning and will have no end. I find that absolutely mesmerizing. And I'm sure there are probably many watching this and going, well, I don't really care. I'm actually happy to live consistently with a harsh reality of a worldview without a transcendent meaning, without being able to give rise to the morality, the scientific method, and rationality. That's fine. But the trouble is that we're all painting our canvas, and you may try to paint consistently with your worldview, but Eva, whoever or whatever Eva is to you, seems to have this awfully persistent habit of making her way onto your canvas. And I've given you the examples of rationality, morality, and the scientific methods. Are they just leaps of absurdity making their way onto a chaotic canvas? Or are they a piece of reality that we can intelligibly recognize? And do they point towards something more? I think that Eva has made her way onto the canvas of many young men in this nation. And because of it, they're searching for this kind of transcendent reference point to ground what matters most to them. And it is my consistent hope, desire, and prayer that Eva will not just be one piece of reality among chaos, but her presence will lead people to this triune God of love, this Trinitarian God of love, who reveals himself, who steps into time, space, history, who enters into the canvas.
Bro, you got a charger? Nah. You tell me you got a car, you ain't got a charger, bro. Yeah, I'm playing. That's bro. Stop being silly, man. Give me the charger. You got bars on? Yeah, man.